I thought that I would try and select something that was nearer to my core collecting interests, which are really airmail used for the purpose for which it was made available to the public. In other words, to speed up communications between correspondents. Really, we're bothered about sending messages to each other rather than souvenir covers, if I may put it like that. And it seemed quite opportune to take this subject, because as far as I was aware, it's not necessarily been done by anyone else. Now, yes, that's right, back to my opening screen. Right, so in 1920, the Indian government, as it says there in the text, with a view to obtaining reliable data for estimating the prospects and costs of a commercial mail service in India, set up an experimental service between Karachi and Bombay, instituted with the assistance of the Royal Air Force. Now, the point of that was effectively the beginnings of a commercial service which was intended to meet up with the overland mail steamers between India and the Western world, which arrived at and departed from Bombay every week. Mail for the northwest of India could be carried by air and make a great saving over a rather circuitous rail journey that otherwise that they would have to undertake. And to conduct this experiment, there was a fleet of twin-engined de Havilland 10 aircraft used, twin-engined. There's a photograph of one of them, and they were on loan from 97 Squadron that was already based in Lahore. Behind the scenes, of course, then they really wanted to decide whether or not they could make good use of the 100 aircraft that the RAF had presented, or the British government had presented to the Indian government at the end of the First War. It was a good way to dispose of aircraft, military aircraft that were no longer needed. And as far as I can work out, then there were not even 100 pilots in India who, so they could have more than one aircraft each if the government could find suitable organizations to whom the aircraft could be donated. So this was very much a proper commercial experiment rather than just planning out where to go next. In the bottom left there, you'll see that I've referred to an article in India Post written by Gordon Anstey in 1971 with a reference there, and I find that very useful, and was certainly for a long time the only one that went into this particular flight, the route, Karachi-Bombay service, in any sort of detail. This is on the left, a scan of the inset page of a short-lived philatelic magazine published in, and it says it's the Western India Philatelic Review. I think it was published at Bombay, certainly by Mr. Somake, who has got a rather unfortunate reputation for producing lots of philatelic covers in India. But this issue carried a rather fairly comprehensive summary of what the Karachi-Bombay Air Service achieved. And I've highlighted there 3 boxes which convey a couple of important points. Firstly, that the service only ran for, in total, a total of 52 days. There were 7 flights in each direction, therefore only 14 flights, and altogether the total number of covers carried was around 3,000. That's based on the calculations that Somake made in 1920, which is very close to the event. And I see that Geoffrey Brown amended that to 2,900. His base figure was 2,200, which Geoffrey Brown increased to 2,900. Well, be that as it may, I can't say one way or the other. The important point from my point of view is that 3,000 covers, give or take a few hundred, is certainly far fewer than were carried on the 1911 Allahabad exhibition flight, and that was just hopping over a river. This new service was 550 miles with an overnight stop across pretty rugged terrain with a specific objective in mind, which was a very ambitious project. Now, at the bottom there, the last box that I've highlighted with the note says that the aeroplanes carrying mail failed twice, once in the outward direction and once on the inward direction, owing to unfavourable climatic conditions, and the mails were carried by rail. Now, outwards was from Karachi to Bombay, inwards was to Bombay, back to Karachi. And I will return to this statement in a few slides' time, but in effect, that means that out of the 14 flights in total, there were 2 serious delays, and I can illustrate both in this series of covers. So on to the first flight. I like to collect covers that have contents, if possible, and they are pretty difficult to come across, and were sent really for a purpose, as I say, not just to collect a souvenir cover, but to convey a message. And I don't think I could get any real accusations of this being a philatelic cover, even though it is on the first flight, and with the commemorative obliteration. Of course, all the mail received the same obliteration. There are no special cachets on any of the flights. But it's from the postmaster at Karachi to his fellow post office official. He's addressed it to Mr. Murtry in Bombay, but it's been redirected to Delhi. The important thing, I think, from my point of view, is that he's paid amount that was required for a registered cover sent by air, which is an astonishing amount, really, when you consider that the basic inland postage from Karachi to Bombay was a half anna. This cost 10.5 annas. 2 annas extra were for registration, of course, and the air fee that was charged per ounce on any letter sent by this service was 8 annas, which is half a rupee, and that's an enormous sum. So the conditions that the service were testing was whether or not the public demand would be sufficient to sustain an economic model to make this a viable prospect. So we'll see how they go. But before we get too much further, I have one other first flight cover, or one other cover from the first flight, in stark contrast to the beauty and cleanliness of the mail that we've seen in the display that's just been presented before. This, I think, is rather more commercial, certainly from my point of view. I live near Bradford in Yorkshire in Britain, and I found this cover on eBay, I have to admit, many years ago, and it's on the first flight. There are no suggestions here that anybody is doing anything other than sending a proper commercial message from a firm in Karachi to one in Bradford. And on receipt there, one of the workers has obviously decided that this was quite an attractive envelope and it shouldn't be put in the bin. So they folded it up neatly and stuffed it inside their overalls pocket, where it's got dog-eared and creased, and eventually it's entered the philatelic market. So I think this has a character to it which supports the service that really it was intended to perform. Of course, it's properly prepaid, 8 annas air fee plus 1.5 annas foreign postage. I haven't got a cover from every flight. That was never really my intention in addressing this subject at all. I've got some selected items from just important points that I've found along my collecting career. So we go to the second flight southwards, which happened to be the second flight, which happened to be, the one after the one we've just seen there, on the 30th of January, from somebody in Karachi writing to London, again, properly paid. And the enclosed letter begs all sorts of questions. He says he's still on his back, but can walk a little bit. He's not allowed to walk, really, because some of his wounds are not yet healed. He says that Mama is fairly fit, and the kiddie is quite fit as well. So that is really very social family correspondence, and one wonders where these wounds were incurred that he still suffers from. So I think that's rather an unusual cover. But from a collector's point of view, the more important cover was the second flight northwards, the return journey from Bombay to Karachi, on leaving Bombay on the 4th of February. Notice that the Bombay postmark on the left, you can hardly see Bombay, but it's the one with the 2 stamps on. That was postmarked on the 3rd, and of course all mail was postmarked at the time it was put into the post, which was not necessarily the day on which the aircraft set off on its journey. So it departed on the 4th of February, arrived at Rajkot for its expected intermediate stop, but on leaving Rajkot, it was forced to make an unexpected landing and effectively couldn't continue with the mail any further. Now, I then say this may be considered the first Indian airmail accident. Well, I support that by saying that although a lot of the experimental and pioneer flights came to some form of disaster along their routes of exploration, this was the first accident to a scheduled flight, and I think that is therefore significant. There have been many since, and in fact, whole catalogues have been compiled just on that basis. Whether that's entirely commercial or not, I don't know. This cover, it doesn't look particularly philatelic to me. But again, I'll just go back to the circumstances of the flight. After leaving Rajkot, which would have been in a sealed bag, so that there's no Rajkot dispatch stamp. Then the next postmark is Karachi on the 10th of February, another 5 days. The questions are really what happened. The original slide I showed of the report said that failed flight inwards was sent by rail rather than continue by air. And I think this demonstrates that point. Rajkot was obviously difficult to communicate with very quickly, and I suppose that it may not have been possible to get a relief aircraft to Rajkot to collect the mail, and or maybe they just didn't even consider that this might have been a possibility. But the post, I reckon, was sent on by rail, and I have further support for this, I think, with the next slide. Now that's another cover from the same flight, the second return flight northwards, this time registered. And again, the Bombay postmark is the 3rd of February, as you see at the bottom left. But this is date stamped at Karachi on the 9th of February, which is the day before the previous cover. The date stamp on the right bottom is at Kimari the following day, which is the seaport for Karachi. So the fact that mail from the second flight that was involved in this accident arrived in 2 separate batches means to me that this couldn't have been flown by air for that leg, and therefore I support my claim that it was sent by rail on that basis. That, I think, is a sort of fact that is, wonderful to research and makes collecting commercial airmail so interesting. Now, the third and fourth flights were fairly uneventful, and I don't have any covers from them, but the most unusual part, I think, of my presentation was that I can fill the gap that's normally found in collections of this subject, because it was intended as a two-way service. Mail was intended to feed the P&O steamer route within India, delivering mail for the northwest of India and collecting it to be sent out from Bombay to GB and Western Europe by sea. And there was intended to be a similar feeder service from Western Europe and GB in that direction. And yet the first cover from GB to India using this service isn't recorded until the fifth flight northwards, the fifth return flight. And in fact, there are apparently only two reported at all. I say in a little box at the bottom right that there's a Gibbon Stamp Monthly article in 2004 saying that this cover, which is illustrated there, is the only known cover in private hands. I've never seen the second cover, and I've never seen it reported. But it does illustrate a very important point, I think, that the service was advertised in GB, in Great Britain. It was a proper post office enterprise, undertaking, and there was a fixed fee of £1 per half ounce, in the same way as the 8 annas was charged in India. Now, there's a question about whether or not the vertical pencil stroke and the pink express label were intended for this to be used for this service. And I think there's a good case to say yes, they were. There was, of course, no suggestion that by airmail labels, the blue labels, or the by air stamp were even considered at this early stage. And in a country like GB, when you had manuscript notes on a single cover among 1,000 others, then it was very difficult to give it any prominence other than by sticking some individual label on and treating them to draw attention to it for special treatment. And I think that's a deliberate attempt by the local post office in Aberdeen, which is in the north of Scotland, to distinguish it for correct treatment and handling by using the express stamp. We could only find out if more covers existed. Anyway, it was paid the right amount, it was handled in the correct way, and it arrived on the 24th of February and arrived at the Bombay on 24th and arrived at Karachi on the 25th. The next cover that I found interesting was on the 6th flight. This is back internally within India. It's from Bombay to Karachi. But the interesting thing is that it's not addressed to someone whom I recognise as any sort of dealer or regular collector. It's addressed to someone on board a steamer, Miss Dakuna, on board the SS. It says Goblenz, or Goblons, which may well be a corruption of the German word for the town of Koblenz, often used for names of ships at Karachi. And the interesting thing is that on the 2nd of March 1920, there had just been the end of a leap year when February had 29 days. So Bombay correctly stamped the date of receipt as the 2nd of March, and when it arrived at Karachi the following day, they also stamped it the 2nd of March, forgetting that there had been an extra day in between, and it should have been the 3rd of March. The Kimari delivery, the Karachi delivery date in the normal post had the correct date in it as the 3rd. And then we come to the end. This was dispatched on the 7th flight southwards correctly paid for international service, 8 annas air fee plus 1.5 annas postage. And finally, the 7th flight northwards, the very last one. Whether it was intended to be the last one or not is a bit uncertain to me. The flight was intended to depart from Bombay on the 6th of March, but it was delayed by bad weather until the 11th. Now, clearly, any advantages that air transmission would have had were completely lost, in fact, thrown out of the window. Through that, the rail service wouldn't have been interrupted by that sort of bad weather at all. So for this particular journey, it has cost at least 10 times the basic fee. It's taken 3 times the length of time that it would have normally taken to get there. And if anybody thought that after that experimental period, you could make a case to have a service like that continuing, then this would have not really been a very good argument in favour. So at that point, no further flights were made in this experiment. So I think that's a rather unfortunate way to have to round off what could have been a very interesting first for having such an early, regularly scheduled service. The government summed it up by saying that little public support remained and the service was discontinued after a few weeks. But the information for the purpose for which the experiment was initiated had been obtained. In other words, it was rather a sad end to an interesting enterprise, and it would take another 9 years before another scheduled service would take place from the Indian mainland, which illustrates that it was a decade in advance of its time. And with that, that's the end of my presentation.